The snow along Route 17 had been disturbed only once that morning, a single set of footprints ending near a drainage culvert where a county worker noticed something wrong. Something still, something that did not belong there, as cold air pressed down and the silence of winter held its breath. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred on January 3, 1986, outside the small upstate New York town of Harrington Falls, a place where winter lingered long after the holidays and where men who had worked factories, rail yards, and volunteer firehouses measured time by seasons rather than years. The woman found near the culvert was later identified as 22-year-old Margaret Ellen Whitaker. She had been reported missing 5 days earlier, just after New Year's Eve, when the decorations were still up in storefront windows and the local paper was running editorials about the coming year. Her disappearance had not initially set off alarms beyond her family and a few coworkers, but the discovery in the snow changed that immediately. Margaret Whitaker lived alone in a rented second-floor apartment above a closed hardware store on Main Street. She worked as a records clerk at a regional insurance office and was known for reliability rather than drama. Police records later described her as punctual, quiet, and financially stable. There was no history of drug use, no volatile relationships, and no prior contact with law enforcement. When she failed to appear for work on January 2, her supervisor called her apartment, then her parents, and finally the Harrington Falls Police Department. A missing person report was filed that afternoon, but by then, the winter weather had already begun to erase any trace of her last movements. The initial examination at the scene near Route 17 was careful and restrained. There was no sign of a struggle visible in the snow beyond the footprints that led investigators to the location. Officers marked tire impressions partially obscured by drifting snow and documented fibers caught on nearby brush. The county medical examiner pronounced Margaret Whitaker deceased at the scene and ordered transport to the regional morgue in Albany due to limited facilities locally. Autopsy findings later indicated she had died from exposure following blunt force trauma, injuries consistent with being struck and left outdoors in freezing conditions. The report avoided speculation, noting only that death would not have been immediate and that the timeline was consistent with the night of December 31. The town reacted with a muted but pervasive unease. Harrington Falls was the kind of place where Thanksgiving turkey drives, winter coat donations, and New Year church services filled the calendar. Violent crime was rare enough to be discussed in vague terms when it occurred elsewhere. Local press coverage reflected that tone, focusing on police statements and urging calm. Flyers with Margaret Whitaker's photograph were still hanging in shop windows when the story shifted from missing woman to homicide investigation. Detectives reconstructed Margaret's final days through bank records, phone logs, and interviews. She had left work early on December 31 due to worsening weather and had been seen that evening at a small grocery store purchasing soup, bread, and a bottle of inexpensive wine. A clerk remembered her because the store had been nearly empty, the snow heavy enough to discourage casual errands. No confirmed sightings placed her anywhere after that point. Her car, a used blue sedan, was found parked legally outside her apartment, undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry into her home, and nothing appeared stolen. The early investigation followed standard procedure. Friends, coworkers, and family were interviewed. A former boyfriend living out of state was eliminated through employment records and travel documentation. Weather conditions limited search efforts and degraded potential evidence. The tire impressions near the culvert could not be conclusively matched to a specific vehicle. Fibers recovered were cataloged, but did not immediately correspond to any known suspect. The case file grew thick with reports, maps, and photographs, then gradually moved to the cold storage shelves as weeks turned into months. By the summer of 1986, the investigation had stalled. Leads were exhausted, and no suspect emerged who could be charged under the evidentiary standards of the time. Margaret Whitaker's death became an unresolved tragedy, referenced occasionally in local retrospectives, and remembered most vividly by those who had lived through that winter. Detectives rotated assignments, and the file was transferred to the county's Unsolved Cases Archive, stored in a climate-controlled room that smelled faintly of paper and dust. For years, the case remained dormant. Advances in forensic science during the 1990s and early 2000s prompted periodic reviews, but the physical evidence collected in 1986 was limited. Still, it had been preserved properly. In 2016, as part of a statewide initiative to re-examine cold cases involving young victims, the Whitaker file was pulled again. Investigators noted that a small biological sample collected from Margaret's clothing had never been tested with modern DNA techniques. Approval was granted for analysis. The results did not provide an immediate match, but were entered into national databases. 2 years later, a partial familial match flagged attention. It led investigators to a man named Thomas Keller, a former delivery driver who had lived briefly in Harrington Falls in the mid-1980s before relocating. Records showed he had been questioned briefly in 1986 after a neighbor reported a suspicious van in the area, but no evidence had connected him to the crime at the time. Further investigation revealed inconsistencies in his employment history and placed him in the vicinity on the night Margaret disappeared. Surveillance and background checks followed. A discarded item collected during a lawful search provided a direct DNA comparison, confirming a match with the sample preserved from 1986. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence carefully, ensuring chain of custody and procedural integrity. In 2021, Thomas Keller was arrested without incident at his residence in another state. The announcement reverberated quietly through Harrington Falls, reported with restraint by the same local paper that had covered the original case decades earlier. The trial concluded in 2023 with a conviction based on forensic evidence, corroborated timelines, and witness testimony from records long overlooked. Keller was sentenced to life imprisonment. There were no dramatic statements, no public spectacle. Margaret Whitaker's family attended the sentencing, and afterward the town returned to its routines. Snow still falls each winter, and Route 17 remains busy with traffic. But the case that once lingered in cold archives finally reached a lawful, documented conclusion, closing a chapter that had remained open for nearly 4 decades. In the months following the discovery of Margaret Whitaker's body, Harrington Falls settled into a subdued routine shaped by winter and work. Snowbanks hardened along sidewalks, and men who had lived through decades of industrial layoffs and economic shifts talked quietly about the case in diners and barbershops. Police continued their methodical review, logging each tip even as they grew fewer. The investigation's early focus remained on reconstructing Margaret's final 48 hours with precision, rather than speculation. Detectives returned repeatedly to her apartment, reviewing photographs and evidence logs. The absence of forced entry suggested familiarity or voluntary movement. Her calendar showed no appointments beyond routine errands. Phone records reflected brief calls to her parents before Christmas and a short conversation with a coworker earlier on December 31. There was nothing to suggest distress. This lack of warning signs complicated the narrative, forcing investigators to consider chance encounters rather than planned meetings. Weather reports were integrated into the timeline. Snowfall intensified late on New Year's Eve, reducing visibility and muffling sound. Traffic cameras on Route 17 were limited in scope at the time, but maintenance logs indicated a lull in plowing activity during the window investigators believed Margaret had been transported. That gap allowed for vehicle movement without immediate detection, a factor that would later gain significance. Witness canvassing extended beyond Harrington Falls into neighboring towns. Gas station attendants, grocery clerks, and late-shift workers were interviewed. Most accounts were routine, describing ordinary winter evenings. One report mentioned a dark-colored van parked briefly near Main Street around dusk, but the description lacked specificity. Without corroboration, it remained an entry in the file rather than a lead. The autopsy report guided investigative priorities. The medical examiner's language was careful, focusing on measurable findings. Injuries suggested a sudden confrontation rather than prolonged struggle. Exposure was listed as the primary cause of death, a detail that weighed heavily on those reviewing the case. It implied abandonment in freezing conditions rather than immediate fatal intent, narrowing behavioral profiles considered by investigators. By February 1986, the case had attracted regional media attention. Coverage remained restrained, emphasizing police diligence and community solidarity. Editorials avoided speculation, reflecting both journalistic caution and local sensibilities. Fundraisers were organized quietly to assist the Whitaker family with expenses. Margaret's photograph appeared in anniversary pieces, her image becoming a symbol of unresolved loss rather than sensational crime. As spring approached, detectives compiled a comprehensive timeline document, cross-referencing every verified sighting and transaction. This document would later become central to renewed investigations. At the time, it served as a final attempt to identify overlooked inconsistencies. None emerged that could support an arrest. Prosecutors advised against pursuing weak charges, emphasizing the importance of evidentiary standards that could withstand scrutiny. The case's transition to inactive status was procedural, not emotional. Officers signed transfer forms and ensured evidence was sealed and cataloged. The Whitaker file was placed in a temperature-controlled archive alongside other unsolved cases, each labeled with dates and brief summaries. For the community, the shift was less formal but equally real. Conversations faded, replaced by new concerns and seasonal rhythms. Years passed. Harrington Falls changed incrementally. Businesses closed and reopened under new ownership. Younger residents moved away while older ones retired. The courthouse basement accumulated records and the cold case archive grew. Periodic audits confirmed evidence integrity, but no new leads surfaced. Margaret Whitaker's name remained in the system, searchable but silent. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic science prompted a review of older cases statewide. Harrington Falls submitted several files, including Margaret's, for preliminary assessment. At that stage, limitations remained. DNA testing required sufficient quality samples, and the preserved material was minimal. Analysts recommended waiting until techniques improved further. The file returned to storage, unchanged but not forgotten. The renewed effort in 2016 differed in scope and resources. A dedicated cold case unit reviewed Margaret Whitaker's case with fresh eyes, unburdened by earlier assumptions. Digital databases allowed cross-referencing of names, vehicles, and addresses in ways previously impossible. The preserved biological sample, once considered marginal, now met thresholds for analysis. Approval was granted after consultation with prosecutors and the Whitaker family. Laboratory results took months. When the partial profile was completed, it was entered into national systems without expectation of immediate results. The subsequent familial match did not identify a suspect directly, but suggested a genetic relationship to an individual previously cataloged. Investigators approached this lead cautiously, aware of the legal and ethical considerations involved. Record searches identified Thomas Keller as a potential relative match. His history showed transient employment and frequent relocations during the mid-1980s. In 1986, he had lived briefly in Harrington Falls while working as an independent delivery driver. Old police logs confirmed he had been questioned informally after a neighbor's report, but released without further action. Investigators reconstructed Keller's movements using archived employment records, rental agreements, and vehicle registrations. They noted discrepancies between his statements in 1986 and documented timelines. Winter delivery routes placed him near Route 17 on December 31, consistent with the estimated window of Margaret Whitaker's disappearance. These findings alone were insufficient for action, but warranted further inquiry. Surveillance conducted decades later was unremarkable, reflecting a life outwardly stable. The investigative focus remained on corroborating past events rather than present behavior. A lawful search yielded items suitable for DNA comparison. Laboratory analysis confirmed a match to the preserved sample from Margaret's clothing, meeting the standard for probable cause. Prosecutors reviewed the case meticulously, revisiting chain-of-custody documentation and ensuring compliance with current legal standards. The decision to proceed was deliberate, informed by forensic confirmation and a coherent reconstructed timeline. In early 2021, an arrest warrant was issued. Thomas Keller was taken into custody without resistance, informed of charges related to the death of Margaret Whitaker. The announcement reached Harrington Falls quietly. Local press reported the arrest with factual restraint, recalling the winter of 1986 and the long years of uncertainty that followed. For many residents, the news reopened memories they had learned to carry without resolution. The case, once defined by absence, moved toward accountability through lawful process and documented evidence. The period between the arrest and the trial unfolded slowly, governed by procedural requirements rather than emotion. Thomas Keller was extradited to New York under standard interstate agreements. Court filings documented each step, from transport to arraignment, with no irregularities noted. Prosecutors emphasized restraint, aware that the strength of the case lay in documentation rather than narrative. The Whitaker file, dormant for decades, was reopened in full and digitized for courtroom use. Pretrial motions focused on admissibility. Defense counsel challenged the age of the evidence, the handling of biological samples, and the relevance of reconstructed timelines. Each challenge was addressed through records preserved since 1986. Evidence logs demonstrated uninterrupted custody. Laboratory certifications confirmed that modern testing protocols had been applied without compromising original material. Judges ruled consistently in favor of inclusion, citing clear documentation and adherence to evolving forensic standards. Investigators prepared to present the case as a sequence of verifiable facts. They avoided speculation, relying instead on records, maps, and data points. A reconstructed timeline placed Margaret Whitaker's movements within a narrow window on December 31, 1985. Keller's documented delivery routes intersected that window geographically and temporally. Weather reports explained how snow conditions could have obscured activity and delayed discovery. Each element reinforced the others, without reliance on conjecture. Witness testimony was limited but precise. Former coworkers described Margaret's habits and confirmed her early departure from work. A grocery store clerk, interviewed again decades later, reaffirmed her recollection of Margaret's purchase on the evening of December 31. Maintenance records from Route 17 corroborated the lull in plowing activity. Though memories had aged, contemporaneous notes preserved in the original case file provided continuity. Expert witnesses addressed forensic findings. The medical examiner's original report was supplemented by modern analysis, explaining how exposure following injury aligned with the estimated timeline. DNA analysts detailed the process by which the partial profile had been developed, matched through familial databases, and confirmed through direct comparison. Their testimony emphasized probability thresholds and error rates, grounding conclusions in measurable standards. Throughout the proceedings, the tone remained controlled. There were no dramatic revelations or courtroom theatrics. The focus was on accumulation rather than spectacle. Jurors were presented with binders of evidence and guided through the chronology step by step. Prosecutors reminded them that the passage of time did not diminish the validity of preserved facts. Defense arguments centered on doubt arising from age, but the consistency of records limited their impact. The trial concluded after several weeks. Jury deliberations were methodical, extending over multiple days. Notes requested clarification on timelines and forensic procedures rather than motives or character. When the verdict was delivered, it was read without embellishment. Thomas Keller was found guilty of charges related to the death of Margaret Whitaker. The courtroom remained quiet, reflecting the gravity rather than the drama of the outcome. Sentencing occurred later that year. The judge referenced the thoroughness of the investigation and the patience of the Whitaker family. Keller received a life sentence under New York law, with no possibility of parole. The ruling emphasized accountability achieved through lawful means, even after decades. There were no public statements from the defense beyond formal notices of appeal, which were later denied. For Harrington Falls, closure arrived without ceremony. The local newspaper ran a final article summarizing the conviction and revisiting the winter of 1986. Older residents recalled where they had been when Margaret was found, how the snow had piled high that year, and how uncertainty had lingered through successive winters. Younger readers encountered the story as history rather than lived experience. The Whitaker family issued a brief written statement expressing gratitude for the persistence of investigators. They avoided commentary on punishment, focusing instead on remembrance. Margaret's name, once associated with unanswered questions, now appeared in records marked resolved. The Cold Case Archive updated its index, moving her file from active review to closed status. In the years following the conviction, the case became a reference point in training materials for cold case units. It illustrated the value of evidence preservation, documentation, and restraint. Investigators emphasized that resolution had depended not on sudden insight, but on incremental advances and careful review. The lesson resonated with departments managing archives filled with similar files. Harrington Falls continued its routines. Winter still arrived early, bringing snow that softened sound and slowed movement. Thanksgiving drives filled collection bins, and New Year services marked the passage of time. Route 17 remained a busy corridor, its culverts and shoulders unremarkable to passing drivers. Few markers indicated what had occurred there decades earlier. Occasionally, the case resurfaced in conversation when discussions turned to unsolved crimes or advances in forensic science. Residents spoke of it with a measured tone, acknowledging both loss and resolution. The absence that had once defined the story was replaced by a documented conclusion. The courthouse basement retained its archives, now more digitized than before. Cold rooms still held boxes labeled with dates and names, reminders of work yet unfinished. Margaret Whitaker's file no longer required review, but it remained accessible, complete with final court orders and sentencing documents. For those who had worked the case at different stages, the resolution affirmed professional discipline. Detectives who had begun their careers in the 1980s reflected on the importance of resisting premature conclusions. Younger investigators saw in the Whitaker case an example of patience rewarded through process. The quiet aftermath extended beyond official circles. Margaret's former apartment building was renovated. The hardware store below reopened as a cafe. Few patrons knew the history of the space. Life moved forward, as it does in small towns shaped by seasons rather than headlines. The case concluded not with celebration but with a return to normalcy. Snow continued to fall, files continued to be stored, and records continued to be kept. The story of Margaret Whitaker became part of Harrington Falls' collective memory, defined not by mystery, but by resolution achieved through lawful, methodical effort, closing a chapter that had begun on a cold morning in January and ended decades later in a courtroom governed by procedure and proof. After the sentence was handed down, the legal machinery that had driven the case for years slowed to a deliberate halt. Appeals were filed and dismissed in sequence, each ruling documented in court records that emphasized precedent and procedure rather than emotion. By late 2024, all avenues had been exhausted, and the conviction stood without qualification. The Whitaker case was formally marked closed within the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. Its status changed from unresolved to solved after 38 years. Attention then shifted to record maintenance and institutional reflection. Evidence was recatalogued one final time, photographs digitized at higher resolution, and transcripts indexed for long-term reference. The county prosecutor's office conducted an internal review, identifying the factors that had preserved the case's viability. Foremost among them was the disciplined handling of physical evidence in 1986, when resources were limited and forensic expectations far different. The decision to store rather than discard marginal samples proved decisive decades later. Training seminars referenced the Whitaker investigation as an example of continuity across generations of law enforcement. Retired officers attended some of these sessions, offering perspective on investigative constraints of the past. They spoke not in terms of regret but realism, noting that procedural caution had prevented wrongful conclusions. Younger investigators listened, understanding that restraint had been as important as persistence. For the Whitaker family, the period following the final ruling was quieter than the months surrounding the arrest and trial. Media interest declined rapidly, consistent with the understated tone that had characterized coverage from the beginning. There were no television specials or public reenactments. The family returned to private routines shaped by long experience with unresolved loss. Closure did not erase absence, but it altered its weight. Margaret Whitaker's name appeared once more in the local paper, this time in a brief notice acknowledging the formal end of proceedings. The article referenced her age, her job, and the winter conditions of 1986, facts repeated without embellishment. It noted the conviction and sentence, then concluded with a line about the importance of patience in justice. Readers familiar with the case recognized the restraint as intentional. In Harrington Falls, physical reminders of the past were subtle. The culvert along Route 17 had been reinforced during routine infrastructure upgrades, its concrete edges smoothed and widened. Snowplows passed regularly in winter, leaving little trace of earlier disturbances. Drivers slowed only for weather, unaware of the history embedded in the landscape. The town's courthouse underwent renovations as well. Filing rooms were reorganized, and older paper records were scanned and stored electronically. During this process, Margaret Whitaker's case file was handled once more, its thickness reflecting years of accumulated review. Clerks ensured that all materials were complete before sealing the physical box for permanent storage. Community discussions about the case became less frequent, emerging mainly during conversations about crime prevention or forensic science. Older residents framed it as a reminder that even quiet towns are not immune to harm. Younger residents encountered it through archived articles or training materials rather than memory. The shared understanding was that resolution had come not through spectacle but through endurance. Law enforcement agencies beyond the county took note. Requests were made for permission to reference the case in academic studies and policy reviews. Analysts examined how familial DNA databases had been integrated responsibly, balancing investigative value with privacy concerns. The Whitaker case was cited as an example where legal thresholds had been met carefully, avoiding overreach. Within the prison system, Thomas Keller's intake and classification followed routine protocols. There were no public statements, no interviews granted. His records reflected a life sentence imposed late in life, a fact noted without commentary in official summaries. The system absorbed him as it does all inmates, focusing on custody rather than narrative. The seasonal cycle continued. Thanksgiving returned each year with food drives and church services. New Year arrived quietly, marked by snowfall and early darkness. For those who remembered 1986, these dates carried layered meaning. They recalled the uncertainty of that winter and the long silence that followed. Now, those memories existed alongside knowledge of accountability. Archivists maintained the cold case index, now smaller by one entry. Other files remained, some older, some newer, each representing unresolved questions. The Whitaker case served as reassurance that resolution was possible even after decades, provided evidence had been preserved and reviewed with care. Occasionally, investigators revisited the case informally, discussing what might have been done differently. These conversations were analytical rather than emotional. They considered the limitations of technology in the 1980s, the absence of centralized databases, and the challenges posed by weather and timing. The consensus was that diligence had been present even when outcomes were delayed. Margaret Whitaker's story, as preserved in official records, ended with sentencing documents and appellate rulings. Beyond those pages, her life remained defined by ordinary details recorded in early reports: a steady job, modest routines, family connections. Investigators were careful to remember those elements when referencing the case, resisting the tendency to reduce a person to an event. The town of Harrington Falls moved forward as it always had, shaped by work schedules, school calendars, and weather forecasts. Snow still accumulated along sidewalks, and older men still gathered in familiar places to talk quietly about the past. When the Whitaker case was mentioned, it was no longer as a question, but as a conclusion reached through lawful means. The investigation's legacy rested not in dramatic revelation, but in procedural integrity. It demonstrated that time could be bridged through documentation, and that restraint could preserve the possibility of justice. As files were closed and shelves reorganized, the system continued its work, guided by the same principles that had eventually resolved a case born in winter, carried through decades, and concluded with proof rather than spectacle. As the years moved beyond the legal conclusion, the Whitaker case settled into a different kind of existence, one defined by documentation rather than investigation. Official summaries replaced active memos, and the language of urgency gave way to the language of record. For agencies involved, the transition marked an end point measured not in emotion but in administrative finality. The file was complete, the outcome fixed, and the responsibility shifted from pursuit to preservation. Within Harrington Falls, the case slowly lost its immediacy without losing its meaning. Older residents, particularly men who had lived most of their lives within a few miles of Main Street, continued to remember the winter of 1986 with clarity. They recalled the weight of snow on rooftops, the muted sound of traffic, and the uneasy knowledge that something had occurred beyond routine hardship. Those memories persisted quietly, surfacing during long conversations about work, family, and time. Local institutions incorporated the case into broader reflections rather than isolated remembrance. The volunteer fire department referenced it during safety trainings as an example of why thorough reporting matters. The town library archived newspaper clippings alongside other historical materials, situating the story within decades of civic life rather than apart from it. The emphasis remained on continuity, not notoriety. Margaret Whitaker's name appeared occasionally in academic discussions focused on cold case methodology. Scholars noted the intersection of early evidence preservation and later technological advancement. They emphasized that success had not depended on reinterpretation of facts, but on the ability to confirm them. The case illustrated how careful restraint in the initial investigation had prevented contamination or loss, allowing future science to operate effectively. For investigators who joined the profession long after 1986, the Whitaker case offered a measured lesson. It showed that not every investigation concludes within expected timelines, and that unresolved cases do not necessarily indicate failure. Instead, they reflect the limits of available tools at a given moment. The discipline lay in maintaining readiness for change without forcing conclusions prematurely. The Whitaker family maintained a private approach throughout these later years. They declined public invitations and avoided commentary beyond brief acknowledgments of process. Their focus remained inward, shaped by decades of living with uncertainty followed by resolution. Those who knew them understood that closure did not arrive as a sudden release, but as a gradual adjustment to a settled truth. Seasonal markers continued to frame memory. Thanksgiving arrived each year with its familiar rituals, echoing the period just before Margaret's final days. New Year followed with cold nights and early darkness, recalling the time when questions had first emerged. These dates no longer carried unresolved dread, but retained a solemn weight, reminders of how ordinary moments can become historical anchors. The physical landscape of Harrington Falls evolved subtly. Roads were repaved, storefronts changed hands, and residential buildings were renovated. The culvert along Route 17 remained functional infrastructure, unmarked and unremarkable. For those aware of its history, it represented how places absorb events without retaining visible scars. Geography continued without acknowledgement, leaving memory to those who carried it. Law enforcement agencies updated protocols influenced in part by cases like Whitaker. Evidence retention standards were reinforced, and interagency data sharing became routine rather than exceptional. Training emphasized patience and documentation, underscoring that future resolution often depends on present discipline. The Whitaker case was cited sparingly, valued more for its instructional clarity than its narrative. Within correctional records, Thomas Keller's status became static. His sentence was recorded, his appeals concluded, and his profile reduced to administrative entries. There were no further developments of public interest. The system treated his incarceration as it does all others, focusing on containment and compliance rather than symbolism. The case's significance lay elsewhere, in its demonstration of lawful accountability. Community memory adjusted accordingly. Conversations about crime shifted to prevention and awareness rather than fear. Harrington Falls did not redefine itself around tragedy. Instead, it integrated the experience into its understanding of resilience and process. Residents continued to trust institutions that had shown persistence without overreach. In archival terms, the Whitaker case reached a stable state. Digital backups were created, and physical materials stored under controlled conditions. Index entries reflected completion, and cross-references linked the case to training resources and policy reviews. Archivists ensured that future researchers would encounter a coherent, documented narrative rather than fragments. The story's endurance rested on its restraint. There were no myths attached, no exaggerated retellings. The facts remained sufficient. A young woman disappeared during winter holidays. Evidence was collected, preserved, and later re-examined. Science advanced. A suspect was identified, charged, and convicted through lawful means. The community acknowledged the outcome and continued forward. For those who remembered Margaret Whitaker as a person rather than a case, the conclusion allowed her memory to exist apart from uncertainty. She was recalled through family stories and personal details recorded early in the investigation. These elements endured alongside official records, reminding those closest to her that life precedes documentation. As time moved on, the Whitaker case occupied its place among resolved matters, neither forgotten nor revisited unnecessarily. It served as a quiet example of how justice can function without spectacle, how patience and procedure can bridge decades. The winter that once defined the beginning of the story no longer held its end. Harrington Falls remained what it had always been, a town shaped by seasons, work, and routine. Snow continued to fall, archives continued to fill, and records continued to be kept. Within that continuity, the Whitaker case stood as proof that even the coldest, longest investigations can reach lawful conclusion when guided by evidence, discipline, and time.